Hey, I'm Kevin Holcomb, Technical Marketing Engineer in Cisco's Industrial IoT Group. And we've been at S4 this week in Miami as part of the POC Pavilion, the Proof of Concept Pavilion, where we have 8 participants that are operating on a common system created by Booz Allen. It's a really nice system here, simulating an automotive factory. Right, so we've got the paint shop here, we've got HMIs, PLCs, SCADA system, everything running here. Got a Cisco switch here that's passing a lot of the traffic to these things. And then over here we've got the final assembly area where again we have a Stratix 5800 switch. That's running a CyberVision sensor, which we're going to use to inform network segmentation. Now the idea with the POC Pavilion is every participant had a different problem statement. And one of our problem statements was to show how we could do network segmentation within the final assembly area. Right? So what we're going to show is that we could use CyberVision to provide that OT context, that visibility to help inform that segmentation.
Yeah. And on the Splunk side, we're bringing all that together. So we're taking all the great data from our own Cisco products as well as the other vendors. And our problem statement was, how do you operationalize that into a SOC? And so we're bringing all that together from the various different machines and different technologies to be able to show how we can actually provide security for IT and OT both within the same platform.
So first, let's take a look at where we fit in with the overall architecture. So what we have here is a CyberVision sensor that's going to run on this Rockwell Stratix 5800 in the assembly zone. And then we also have a CyberVision sensor running on the IE9320 here in the plant ops area. And over here in a server in the IDMZ, we have CyberVision and we have Identity Services Engine installed there. Okay, so the idea here is we've got this 2-tier architecture. We've got the sensors looking at all the traffic going between the HMIs and the PLCs and everything. And it's going to do all the deep packet inspection there. We're going to report just the metadata up to the CyberVision Center, which runs here. Okay, and remember our problem statement is for the POC Pavilion is to do segmentation within this Rockwell zone, within the assembly zone here. Okay, so first let's look at what we can see in CyberVision. So after we get the devices in, we're watching all the data go by. We've been recording it for a little while now. And we see all the devices. We can see the communication patterns between those devices. And we've grouped the devices. Right now, in this scenario, the subnets were divided. So we knew there was a certain subnet for the paint shop. There was a certain subnet for assembly zone, etc. So we divided these devices into those zones, and you can get some really nice visualizations in that way to understand exactly what's happening on your network, right? So you can go up to a higher level and you can look at your zones and conduits view here. We can see what's happening in these different conduits, like what kind of devices are communicating through those. And then we can also go in to show all activities. So for segmentation, this is one of the really important pieces. We need to understand what the devices are that are out there and how they are communicating with other devices, right? So that's where the network visibility in the OT environment becomes very important for figuring out how to do the segmentation. And so let's look over at the assembly zone in particular. So we have some PLCs down here, some HMIs, and we can learn some things about these. This is a CyberVision feature that we're able to, from that deep packet inspection, we're able to determine firmware versions. We're able to look at model reference numbers. Then once we have that sort of information, we can figure out that there's vulnerabilities, right? We can cross-reference those and show those to you. But here, for the purposes of segmentation, let's say that in this area, we found, by looking at the traffic patterns, we found that there's workstations here that don't necessarily need to talk with these PLCs that are maybe critical to our operation down in the assembly ops area. Right? So maybe in a segmentation policy, we want to say, if I plug in a new device, maybe I give it least privileges, right? A new device comes into the assembly zone. I'm going to give it least privileges to maybe to communicate with other things in assembly zone, but not necessarily assembly ops. I would need to promote that device in order to allow it to communicate with the devices in assembly ops. So this is the important part. Now I've got OT context now. I've been able to visualize these. I've been able to do virtual segmentation, right, within CyberVision and divide my devices into groups. And now let's pass that over to Identity Services Engine. So what will happen is this OT context that the OT engineer that's very familiar with the process and what devices need to talk to each other, that person can now define those in CyberVision, and then CyberVision is going to pass that context over to Identity Services Engine. And the way it will look over there is we're going to build profiles. And so if I look at my connected devices now, notice I've got endpoint profile. So I've been able to profile those devices now based on the information I got from CyberVision into assembly zone, into the assembly ops, into maybe a ServiceNow group. And I'm able to put all those devices into these groups, and I've passed that context over. So the important concept here is that the OT engineer that's very close to the process doesn't necessarily have to know all the bells and whistles of Identity Services Engine, right? So you allow your IT side to maybe define the high level security posture, the high level profiling, and maybe and to define which buckets can talk to other buckets. But what goes in each bucket is actually defined by the OT side, because they're closer to the process and will understand what needs to communicate with each other better. So the way it will look in Identity Services Engine now is, if we look at the policy, we get this policy matrix. And so within the policy matrix, we can see all our different zones here. And we can see that we are allowing some traffic and we are disallowing some. And then these blue ones, the blue ones mean that it's like a conditional permit, right? Maybe I'm only going to allow certain ports or something like that. Now, for purposes of what we're doing here, notice we've got assembly ops and assembly zone, and we are blocking traffic between those two, right? So recall that I've got this VM here. This is a little machine. I'll call it the assembly zone device monitor. And it's out here in the assembly zone. This is some new device that's shown up, right? So it's been given least privileges to begin with. I'm in the assembly zone and I'm here, right? Now, if I go into this little app here, notice that it's not able to reach any of those PLCs that are within the assembly ops area, right? So everything here is red, not able to communicate with anything. So it makes sense, right? Because based on our TrustSec matrix, I shouldn't be allowed to communicate with these devices. But now if I go back into CyberVision and I say, actually, I want this machine to be able to communicate with these devices, it should be allowed. So I go into here to manage group and I say, let's move to an existing group. Let's move this over to assembly ops. Okay, so at this point, I've moved that device over to assembly ops because I've deemed it to be it should be part of this process. It should be able to communicate with these devices. And now I see that I have moved my little assembly zone device monitor down here into assembly ops. And if I go back now, remember that if I'm in assembly ops, I should be able to communicate with other devices in assembly ops. I can see that right here in the TrustSec matrix. And if I go back over here to my device monitor now, notice that everything is green because I am now actually able to communicate with those devices, right? So in doing this, the OT engineer maybe using CyberVision did not necessarily have to understand all the bells and whistles of ICE. We were able to take that OT context that we gained by visibility into the network, into the OT network. We were able to take that context now and push that over to Identity Services Engine to realize the segmentation capabilities in the assembly zone. So I should note now, the switch that has to be there anyway in order for devices and PLCs and HMIs to talk to other devices, it has to be there. It's now I'm getting network visibility from that through CyberVision into the OT assets and communications. It's become my enforcement point now for segmentation as well. We can additionally make it an agent with secure equipment access, so you can get zero trust remote access to your devices as well. So that single piece of infrastructure that you've invested in, the customer's invested in for networking, it's now security is actually fused into that now, into that investment. So really leveraging that investment that's been made to get the maximum benefit from it.
So we're here within our enterprise security, and what we're doing is receiving alerts from a lot of different sources that are in this part of this POC community, so both our own Cisco products as well as others. If you notice, I filtered this down to a particular incident, a particular IP. And so we see the various things such as files being downloaded, we see some risk-based alerting, as well as various different kinds of activities. Now, realistically, what we would do is we would then group this into an incident. And so what we've done here is we've created this incident to investigate the suspicious activity with that. and we see various different kinds of activities. One of the things we were asked to show was with CyberVision about an ICE blocking unauthorized communications, and so we see that here within Splunk as well. Any of these, I can also just click on the investigation and be able to view the details of that investigation. And so we're going to have the details here of that investigation. So all the different activities that went into it, as well as information such as MITRE ATT&CK, what are the applications that have detected this? So for instance, we have multiple applications and any assets or things that are involved in this instance. And then within Splunk, you can create these response playbooks. And we have the output of those playbooks over here on the left, where we've been asked to do additional triage, such as looking at other activity related to this IP, any login behavior, or any other behaviors that we've done the investigation on. And so this has allowed us to kind of tie all those things together, both IT and OT, all together in one view.